Just to sum up what we've seen in the last couple of videos, in order to argue that Ibn Ezra only became familiar with Rashbam's commentaries between when he wrote his first commentaries to the Chumash and when he wrote his second long commentary to Shemot later, we note all these things. Ibn Ezra's long commentary emphasizes that Moshe had a speech defect and not just an accent. And that seems to be specifically attacking Rashbam's view that Moshe only had an accent because God wouldn't give the Torah to somebody with a speech defect who couldn't speak clearly. Ibn Ezra's second commentary to Shemot, his long commentary, also rejects the claim that Moshe was punished at the Malon for saying Shlach na biyad tishlach. And that's something which Rashbam claims did happen. Rashbam claims the reason Moshe is being punished at the Malon is a punishment for saying Shlach na biyad tishlach earlier. Not only that, here I indented this a bit, it's a subcategory of that, not only is Ibn Ezra rejecting this position in his long commentary but not his short commentary, but when he rejects it, he rejects any connection between Moshe's refusal to do his mission and the various leg injuries suffered by Yaakov and Bilam. Those are proposed by Rashbam a little bit here in Shemot, and in the case of Bilam, it's not even mentioned here in Shemot, but it's mentioned by Rashbam's commentary to Breshit, where he talks about the story of Yaakov. So all of this together sounds like Ibn Ezra's long commentary to Shemot is very concerned with things that Rashbam wrote in his commentaries to Breshit and Shemot. On the other hand, Ibn Ezra's first commentary to Breshit doesn't seem at all concerned with these issues, right? Issue number one of the speech defect. So on that, Ibn Ezra's short commentary said very calmly that kvad peh and kvad lashon could mean two things. Maybe it means a speech defect and an accent. So maybe Moshe had an accent too, but he's not concerned with the idea of whether it's possible for a Navi to have a speech defect. He only starts to really care about that in the long commentary. And as for B and C, the short commentary to Shemot doesn't talk at all about the question of whether the Malon is a punishment for what Moshe said earlier. It just takes for granted that the whole issue with the Malon has to do with circumcision. And so it seems that it didn't even dawn on Ibn Ezra that anybody would possibly think that God wanted to kill Moshe at the Malon as a punishment for saying Shlach na biyad tishlach, until he found out that Rashbam said that in his commentary. And so for all of those reasons, there was two separate units when we learned it in class, the unit about Moshe's speech defect and the unit about whether Moshe was punished for saying Shlach na biyad tishlach. If we put that all together, a very compelling picture emerges that when Ibn Ezra was living in Italy in his early 50s and first writing his commentaries to Chumash, he was not familiar with Rashbam's commentary on the Torah, but later in life, when he was living in France, which was Rashbam's home country, at that point, either through a written text or just through stuff he heard people reporting to him, he became familiar with the idea of the content of Rashbam's commentary and felt the need to respond to it. I would suspect, of those options, whether he heard about a comment or he actually read it, I would suspect that he read it because of this last point C. The fact that he's aware of the exact proofs that Rashbam gives, you have to figure if you heard it orally, if someone passed through his town in France and said, oh, last week I was in Rashbam's town and Rashbam gave a great shiur about why Moshe was punished, it's hard to know if that guy who would be reporting it orally would remember all of Rashbam's proofs. Maybe yes, but if Ibn Ezra saw the parish in writing, then for sure he saw all of Rashbam's proofs, and so he's responding to all of those proofs. Someone might ask, finally, who cares? This is something we didn't really discuss in class. Why do I care so much? Why do I think it's worth spending so much class time talking about when Ibn Ezra got his hands on Rashbam's commentary? So of course, for historians, especially intellectual historians who want to know the history of ideas and what ideas were familiar to people in what societies, it's very important. Ibn Ezra is a very important figure because he moves from the Muslim world to the Christian world. So those historians are really interested in knowing whether Ibn Ezra brings new ideas from the Muslim world to Christian Europe and whether he absorbs new ideas in the Christian world that he didn't know about before. The reason I care about it, I think, religiously is a little different. I think there's a very powerful lesson here for all of us in terms of always being willing to learn new things and reconsider new things. I think sometimes we have these images in our minds of great Talmidei Chachamim, great Torah scholars, who learn in yeshiva for many, many years when they're young, when they're your age, and then when they're in their 20s, maybe even when they're in their 30s. And at some point when they're, 40, they hit this turning point where they've been learning all these years before, maybe become even younger when they're 30. And once they know enough, they're a big Talmid Chacham, then from then on they give shiurim and write books. And I think when you look at many of the great rabbinic figures that we have in our history, you see the extent to which it's not true. And we saw earlier in this semester, when we studied some of the writings of Rashi and Rav Yosef Kara, we saw how Rashi has his Perushim that he wrote, and then he continues to learn, and sometimes certain of his close friends and students, like Yosef Kara, there are other cases where the same is true of Rashbam, his grandson who learned with him at the end of his life, but especially Yosef Kara, who was closer to his own age, they learned together, and Yosef Kara has a great idea, and Rashi says, you know what, that's such a good Perush, let me go back to my commentary and edit my own commentary to incorporate this idea that someone else taught me. Rashi could have easily said, look, I'm the greatest rabbi of my generation. Yosef Kara, it's very nice that you know Tanakh well also, but if you have a better idea, go write your own Perush. And instead Rashi says, you know what, I'm willing to incorporate his ideas into my Perush. And so Rashi, even at the end of his life, is always open to new ideas and trying to relearn the same stories he learned earlier with new insights. And you see this with Ibn Ezra as well. Ibn Ezra doesn't even begin writing his Perushim until he's at least in his late 40s. He might even be over 50 at that point. And we see, as Ibn Ezra travels through Christian Europe, he's constantly trying to read their Perushim. Now, he doesn't always agree with them. In fact, he often disagrees with their whole style of learning, which leads him to disagree very strongly. In this case, he pretty forcefully says, Chalila, to believe this Perush. But look, if he wanted, he could have ignored it. He could have said, these Ashkenazim don't know how to learn Tanakh, I'm going to ignore them. And instead, he takes his time to read Rashbam's Perush. There are other examples like this where he, without naming Rashi, responds to Rashi's Perush. And so he's very aware of how they're learning Tanakh in northern France as he passes through there. He tries to process it. If he disagrees, he disagrees. But he never says, you know what, when I left Spain when I was in my late 40s, I already was a great scholar of Tanakh, and so I don't need to waste my time reading new Perushim. On the contrary, he's always looking to learn new Perushim, read new Perushim, and see what he can learn from them. If he agrees, he agrees. If he disagrees, he might criticize them, but he is always taking the time to treat their arguments seriously, to read what they have to say, and if he disagrees, to write a thoughtful rejection of it. Here he says why he thinks that these other examples that Rashbam gave are not good examples, rather than just having sort of an arrogant perspective of thinking that, I already learned enough, I don't need to learn anymore in my 50s and 60s. So I think we can all learn from that the importance of not only learning Torah when we're young, when we're your age, but even as we get older, to always remain curious about learning new approaches to things that we learned in our youth.